I'm about to tell you something that might just change how you see the world. We're living in an ice age right now. Yes, seriously. It started about 2.6 million years ago, and technically, it hasn't ended. But here's where it gets even stranger. Every 100,000 years, like clockwork, our planet undergoes this incredible transformation. Massive ice sheets spread across huge parts of the continents, and then they melt away, only to return again. It's a cycle that has shaped the very evolution of life on Earth. I find myself wondering, what's so special about that 100,000-year mark? It turns out it has everything to do with the way Earth subtly wobbles as it travels through space. The story of how we figured this out is, in itself, quite remarkable. But before we dive into the science, let's consider what this cycle actually creates. When Earth tips into a full glacial period, it becomes home to some of the most magnificent and bizarre creatures imaginable. Think woolly mammoths lumbering across frozen grasslands, giant ground sloths carving out tunnels the size of houses, and saber-toothed cats hunting prey that could weigh several tons. About 10,000 years ago, many of these incredible animals simply vanished. The cycle shifted, the ice melted, and suddenly, the megafauna that had dominated the planet for hundreds of thousands of years couldn't survive. We're still trying to understand exactly why. Was it climate change, or was it the impact of humans, or perhaps a combination of both? The debate continues. I want to break down this 100,000-year cycle to understand how it works, why it happens, and what kind of world emerges during these cold phases, and what happens when the cycle shifts back to warmer conditions. I want to introduce you to the creatures that thrived in the Ice Age, explore how humans survived and adapted, and understand why it all came crashing down relatively recently. And finally, I want to consider where we are in the cycle right now and what that might mean for our future. Let's start with the basics. An ice age isn't simply a cold period. It's an extended stretch of time, millions of years, where Earth's temperature drops enough for massive ice sheets and glaciers to take over large portions of the planet's surface. And as I mentioned, we're currently in the Pleistocene Ice Age, which began about 2.6 million years ago and technically hasn't ended. Within any ice age, there are fluctuations, glacial periods where it's intensely frozen, and interglacial periods where it warms up. We're in an interglacial period at the moment and have been for about 11,700 years. So, when people speak of the Ice Age, they usually mean the last glacial period, which stretched from about 115,000 years ago to 11,700 years ago. That's when the ice sheets were at their largest, and the megafauna truly ruled the world. During that last glacial period, the temperature was only about 6 degrees Celsius colder than today, on average. 6 degrees might not sound like much, but we're not talking about 6 degrees in one location. We're talking about 6 degrees worth of thermal energy being drawn out of the entire planet, the oceans, the land masses, the whole atmosphere. That's enough to completely transform the world. Huge ice sheets blanketed most of Canada and northern Europe. The Laurentide ice sheet in North America and the Fennoscandian ice sheet in Europe were kilometers thick in some places. Because so much water was locked up in ice, sea levels dropped by over 100 meters. You could walk from England to France. You could stroll from Asia to Alaska across what is now the Bering Strait. The coastlines were utterly different, and the landscape was mostly tundra and cold grasslands. dry and windswept, nothing like the forests we know today. So, what triggered all of this? Why does Earth go through these dramatic swings roughly every 100,000 years? The answer, surprisingly, begins with a Serbian scientist named Milutin Milankovic. Back in the early 1900s, this man had an insight that no one else had really considered. What if ice ages weren't caused by anything on Earth, but by changes in Earth's position relative to the Sun? You see, Earth's orbit isn't perfectly circular, it's slightly elliptical. And the shape of that ellipse changes over time, influenced by the gravitational pulls of other planets, particularly Jupiter and Saturn. Sometimes our orbit is more circular, sometimes more stretched out. And this cycle of changing from circular to elliptical and back takes about 100,000 years. That's the first Milankovitch cycle, called eccentricity. When Earth's orbit is highly elliptical, the distance between Earth and the Sun varies more dramatically throughout the year. This affects how much solar radiation reaches different parts of the planet at different times. And here's the crucial point. It's not just about the total amount of sunlight Earth receives, it's about where and when that sunlight arrives. Northern Hemisphere summers are key, because that's where most of the landmass is. If Northern Hemisphere summers are cool enough that winter snow doesn't fully melt, the snow lingers. Year after year, it accumulates, and eventually you have ice sheets forming. Once ice sheets begin to grow, they reflect more sunlight back into space, which cools things down even further, allowing more ice to form. It's a self-reinforcing feedback loop. But eccentricity isn't the only cycle at play. There's also obliquity, which is the tilt of Earth's axis. The more tilted Earth is, the more extreme the seasons become. This tilt varies on a roughly 41,000-year cycle. When Earth is less tilted, the difference between summer and winter is milder, which means summer might not be warm enough to melt all the winter ice. Ice accumulates, and an ice age begins. The third cycle is precession, or wobble. Earth wobbles on its axis, much like a spinning top as it slows down. It's strange to think that the very thing that dictates our long-term climate, these cycles of eccentricity, obliquity, and precession, isn't driven by the strongest force. The 100,000-year eccentricity cycle, the one that ultimately dominates, is actually the weakest in terms of changing incoming solar radiation. When the scientists started pulling up cores from the ocean floor and ice, they expected other cycles to be more prominent. Yet, the 100,000-year pattern kept showing up. It's a puzzle they call the 100,000-year problem, and they're still working to fully understand it. The current leading theory suggests that feedback mechanisms amplify this weaker cycle. Perhaps the slow, gradual buildup of ice sheets, followed by a relatively quick collapse, plays a role. The system spends a long time slowly accumulating ice during the cooler phases, only to melt rapidly when conditions shift. This asymmetry could explain why the 100,000-year pattern is so prominent. What we do know is this. For the last million years or so, Earth has been going through this 100,000-year climate cycles, with ice slowly building up over tens of thousands of years, followed by relatively rapid melting. And then the cycle begins again. And it was during those cold phases that the world became home to some of the most incredible creatures to ever walk the planet, the megafauna. The word mega is no exaggeration. Some of these creatures weighed 4,500 kilograms or more. There are theories about why everything got so big during ice ages. One idea is Bergmann's rule, which states that in colder climates, mammals tend to be larger. A bigger body has a lower surface area to volume ratio, meaning less heat loss. That's why polar bears are bigger than other bear species and why Ice Age mammals tended to be gigantic. But size alone doesn't tell the whole story. These animals had incredible adaptations for surviving in a frozen world. The most famous, the poster child of the Ice Age, is the woolly mammoth. Woolly mammoths weren't quite as huge as you might imagine. They were about the same size as modern elephants, maybe a bit shorter, but their bodies were built completely differently. They had thick, shaggy fur with 2 layers, a dense underwool, and longer outer guard hairs. This coat could be up to 1 meter long in places, providing insulation so effective that mammoths could handle temperatures of 40 degrees. They also had small ears to minimize heat loss, unlike modern elephants with their big floppy ears used for cooling off. And they had a layer of fat up to 9 centimeters thick for extra insulation and energy storage. Their skulls were specially shaped too, with large sinus cavities that helped warm and humidify the cold, dry air before it reached their lungs. Breathing in super cold air can damage your lungs, so this was a crucial adaptation. And their teeth were perfect for grinding the tough grasses and sedges that grew on the mammoth steppe, a unique cold grassland ecosystem that covered huge areas during glacial periods. As their teeth wore down, new ones would move forward from the back of the jaw. A mammoth would go through 6 sets of teeth in its lifetime. We know so much about mammoths because some have been found frozen in permafrost, almost perfectly preserved with fur, skin, and even stomach contents intact. Scientists have studied what they ate, extracted their DNA, and found that they had special hemoglobin variants that worked better in the cold, allowing their blood to deliver oxygen more efficiently in freezing temperatures. These animals were finely tuned for Ice Age conditions. But mammoths weren't alone. The Ice Age world was packed with megafauna. Woolly rhinoceroses roamed the same landscapes, covered in thick fur with massive horns that could reach over 1 meter long. They used these horns to plow through snow to reach vegetation underneath. Giant ground sloths lived in the Americas, and these weren't the cute little tree sloths we know today. Some species weighed several tons and could stand up to 4 meters tall on their hind legs. They were too big to climb trees, so they lived on the ground, feeding on vegetation and incredibly digging burrows. We've even found their burrows, tunnels up to 40 meters long with claw marks on the walls that matched their fossilized claws perfectly. There were glyptodonts, basically car-sized armadillos with shells made of fused bone plates. They couldn't roll up like modern armadillos, but they didn't need to. Their shells were tough enough to stop most predators, and some species had club-like tails covered in bony spikes that they could swing as weapons. Recent studies suggest they might have been able to rear up on their hind legs, which means you could have had these armored tanks standing upright and swinging spiked clubs. That's both awesome and terrifying. And then there were the predators. Saber-toothed cats prowled the Americas with canine teeth up to 18 centimeters long, curved like daggers. They used these to deliver killing bites to the throat or belly of prey, causing massive bleeding. Cave lions in Europe and Asia were larger than modern lions. Giant short-faced bears in North America might have been the largest mammalian land predators ever, standing over 3 meters tall on their hind legs. Dire wolves hunted in packs and had more powerful jaws. I've always been fascinated by the sheer scale of time and how different the world can be across millennia. Imagine a planet dominated by giants, locked in a seemingly endless cycle of ice and thaw. For hundreds of thousands of years, ice sheets would grow, megafauna would thrive, only for the ice to melt and forests to expand, starting the cycle all over again. But then, about 11,700 years ago, something shifted. The ice melted as before, but this time, most of the megafauna didn't survive. Within a few thousand years, they were gone. And the question that haunts me is, why? Why did the cycle that sustained them for so long suddenly fail? Was the warming too rapid? Or had humans, evolving and spreading through these cycles, finally developed the technology to hunt them to extinction? Or was it some combination of both? Let's journey back to the last glacial maximum, about 20,000 years ago, the coldest point in this 100,000-year cycle. Ice sheets were at their peak, and the world was unrecognizable. Picture ice covering all of Canada, reaching deep into the northern United States. In some places, it was up to 3 kilometers thick. That's like stacking the Burj Khalifa, the world's tallest building, more than 3 times over, but instead of steel and glass, it was solid ice covering an area the size of a continent. The weight of this ice was so immense that it pressed down on the Earth's crust, deforming the solid rock below. Europe had its own massive ice sheet, the Fennoscandian, blanketing Scandinavia, the Baltic, parts of Britain, and northern Russia. All told, we're talking about maybe 15 million cubic kilometers of ice sitting on land. To give you an idea, if you spread all that ice evenly over the entire land surface of Earth, it would be about 100 meters deep everywhere. With so much water locked up, sea levels dropped by 120 meters, the height of a 40-story building. Coastlines extended far beyond where they are today. The English Channel didn't exist. Britain was connected to mainland Europe by dry land. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. Indonesia, now thousands of islands, was mostly a single landmass connected to mainland Asia. Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania formed one giant continent. And between Alaska and Siberia, where the Bering Strait is today, there was a huge grassy plain called Beringia. The world map looked completely different. But it wasn't just the coastlines that changed. The climate was totally different. It wasn't just colder, it was drier, much drier. With so much water locked in ice, and with colder ocean temperatures reducing evaporation, there was simply less moisture in the atmosphere. Deserts expanded, rainforests shrank to tiny pockets. The Amazon basin was much drier, probably a mix of grassland and scattered trees. The Sahara was even bigger than it is today. Large parts of the world were covered in tundra or steppe, cold, dry grasslands with almost no trees. The ice sheets acted like giant refrigerators, generating cold, dense air that flowed off the ice in powerful winds. These winds picked up dust and silt from the exposed ground and carried it hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. Some parts of China have dust deposits over 100 meters thick that accumulated during glacial periods. The dust storms must have been incredible, blotting out the sun for days at a time. This was the world at peak glaciation, harsh, cold, dry, and wind-swept. And yet, life not only survived here, it thrived. The megaporna weren't just barely scraping by, they were dominating these ecosystems, existing in numbers that probably matched or exceeded the density of large animals in Africa today. The mammoth steppe was the dominant ecosystem across huge swaths of the northern hemisphere. This was a type of grassland that doesn't really exist anymore. A unique mix of grasses, sedges, herbs, and low shrubs that could handle cold, dry conditions, and it supported enormous populations of large herbivores, mammoths, bison, horses, reindeer, all grazing together in huge herds. It must have been an incredible sight. Mammoths were the most iconic, but they weren't the only giants. Woolly rhinoceros, just as impressive, similar in size to modern rhinos, but built for the cold. They had thick woolly coats, two horns, with the front one being absolutely massive, sometimes over a meter long, and they used these horns as snowplows to clear away snow and reach the vegetation underneath. We found woolly rhinos preserved in permafrost, too, just like mammoths, with their fur and soft tissue intact. And like mammoths, they show clear adaptations for extreme cold, including small ears and thick layers of fat. Giant ground sloths were dominating the Americas. Modern sloths are these cute, slow-moving animals that hang in rainforest trees, but Ice Age ground sloths were nothing like that. The largest species, Megatherium americanum, had an estimated body mass of 3,800 kilograms, heavier than most elephants. They could stand on their hind legs and reach heights of 4 meters or more. These were elephant-sized sloths, too big to climb trees, living on the ground and feeding on vegetation. And here's where it gets really interesting. We found their burrows, actual tunnels dug into hillsides, some of them 40 meters long and nearly 2 meters wide. Imagine encountering a multi-ton sloth emerging from an underground tunnel. It sounds made up, doesn't it? But it's real. I've been poring over the evidence of these creatures, and it's just staggering to consider. Those tunnels, by the way, the ones the giant sloths emerged from, the walls and ceilings of these burrows still bear claw marks that match perfectly with ground sloth claws. Scientists believe they dug these burrows either to escape extreme temperatures or to hide from predators. Then there were the glyptodons, another bizarre group. They were relatives of modern armadillos, but scaled up to ridiculous proportions. They weighed up to 2 tons and lumbered around on elephant-sized legs. Their bodies were protected by shells made of hundreds of bony plates fused together, kind of like a turtle shell, but much larger and heavier. These shells could be over 1.5 meters long and were tough enough to stop almost any predator. Some glyptodon species even had tails covered in bony rings with spikes on the end. Basically, a medieval mace attached to their body. Recent biomechanical studies suggest they could rear up on their hind legs, which means these armored tanks could stand upright and swing their spiked tails as weapons. It's absolutely wild to think about. The diversity of megafauna during the Ice Age is just staggering. In North America alone, you had mammoths, mastodons, which were a different family of proboscideans with different tooth structures, American horses, American camels, giant beavers the size of bears, stag moose with enormous antlers, and multiple species of giant ground sloths. In South America, you had even more ground sloth species, glyptodons, giant armadillos, toxodons, which were kind of like hippo-sized rodent relatives, and macrochinia, which looked like a weird cross between a camel and a small elephant with a trunk. In Eurasia, there were mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave bears, steppe bison, giant deer called megaloceros, with antlers spanning over 3.5 meters, and more. And then there were the predators, because wherever you have large herbivores, you have large carnivores hunting them. Saber-toothed cats are probably the most famous Ice Age predator. Smilodon in the Americas had those incredible canine teeth, up to 18 centimeters long and flattened like blades. These weren't for crushing bone or gripping, they were precision killing tools. Saber-tooths would use their powerful forelimbs to wrestle prey to the ground, then deliver a killing bite to the throat or belly, severing major blood vessels and causing rapid death from blood loss. The La Brea tar pits in California have preserved thousands of Ice Age animal bones, and saber-tooths are among the most common carnivores found there. This tells us they were successful predators, probably living in social groups like modern lions. And their prey wasn't small. They were taking down bison, young mammoths, horses, giant ground sloths, big, dangerous animals. Cave lions in Europe and Asia were larger than modern African lions and probably hunted similar prey. Cave bears, despite the scary name, were mostly herbivorous, but they were huge, up to half a ton, and their size alone made them formidable. And then there were giant short-faced bears in North America, which might have been the largest mammalian land predators ever to exist. These bears stood over 3 meters tall on their hind legs and may have weighed up to 800 kilograms. There's debate about whether they were active predators or scavengers, but either way, you definitely didn't want to run into one. Dire wolves were another major predator, especially in the Americas. Real dire wolves, not the fantasy version. They were larger and more heavily built than modern gray wolves, with more powerful jaws designed for crushing bone. They hunted in packs and could take down prey much larger than themselves through coordinated attacks. The La Brea tar pits have yielded thousands of dire wolf fossils, more than any other carnivore, which suggests they were incredibly common. Even birds got in on the megafauna action. Teratorns were some of the largest flying birds ever, with wingspans over 3.5 meters. They probably soared on thermals like modern condors, searching for carrion. And there were even larger flightless birds in some regions. The Ice Age world had no shortage of impressive and terrifying predators. But here's what's really fascinating. All of these animals, from the smallest ground squirrels to the largest mammoths, were part of functioning ecosystems. They weren't just wandering around randomly. They had complex relationships with each other and with their environment. Herbivores competed for food and space. Predators hunted herbivores. Scavengers cleaned up the remains. Plants evolved to withstand grazing prey. It was all interconnected, and the megafauna themselves were ecosystem engineers. Mammoths, for example, didn't just eat grass. They knocked down trees, creating and maintaining open grasslands. They distributed nutrients across the landscape through their dung. They created trails and wallows. Their actions shaped the entire ecosystem. When you have animals that weigh several tons moving through an environment, they have a huge impact. Scientists have reconstructed these ancient ecosystems using multiple lines of evidence. Fossil assemblages tell us which animals live together in the same places. Isotope analysis of bones and teeth tells us what they ate and what the climate was like. Ancient DNA can be extracted from permafrost sediments, even from sediments with no visible fossils, and this tells us which species were present. Cave paintings created by humans show what animals looked like and how they behaved. By combining all this evidence, we can paint a pretty detailed picture of Ice Age life. One thing that's become clear is that these ecosystems weren't static. They changed and shifted as the climate fluctuated. Remember, even within a glacial period, there were shorter-term climate variations. Events called Dansgaard-Oeschger oscillations caused rapid warming spikes lasting decades to centuries, then rapid cooling again. The Ice Age wasn't just a static, frozen world, it was dynamic. The temperature constantly swung back and forth, changing where animals could live, what plants grew, and which creatures thrived or struggled. Our human ancestors were a part of this world, living alongside the megafauna. We hunted them, competed with predators, and adapted our technology and culture to survive the glacial conditions. In Europe, Neanderthals had already lived through these cycles for hundreds of thousands of years. They were cold-adapted, with stocky builds and large nasal cavities to warm the air. They were sophisticated tool users, hunting megafauna, making complex weapons, using fire, and even creating symbolic art and burial rituals. Then, around 45,000 years ago, modern humans, Homo sapiens, arrived in Europe. We brought new technologies, more complex social structures, and wider trade networks. For thousands of years, we overlapped with Neanderthals, sharing the landscape and the megafauna. And as we now know from genetic evidence, we even interbred. Most people of European or Asian descent carry 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. In other parts of the world, modern humans were adapting to Ice Age conditions and living alongside megafauna in Asia, Australia, which humans reached at least 65,000 years ago, and eventually the Americas. The interaction between humans and megafauna is one of the most debated topics in Ice Age research. But for now, just try to imagine the sheer diversity and strangeness of life during peak glaciation. Imagine standing at the last glacial maximum, looking out over ice sheets and cold grasslands, watching mammoths, rhinos, and giant sloths moving through the landscape. You'd be witnessing something that will probably never exist again. These ecosystems are gone now. The megafauna are extinct. The mammoth steppe has vanished, replaced by forests and tundra. It's a lost world. But that world was created by the 100,000-year cycle. The cold phase of the cycle created the conditions, and life adapted to fill every available niche. For hundreds of thousands of years, this pattern repeated: cold phase, megafauna thrive; warm phase, forests expand; cold phase again, megafauna return. It was a rhythm that life on Earth had adapted to. And then, about 19,000 years ago, something started to shift. The orbital cycles were moving into a configuration that favored warming, Northern Hemisphere summers were getting stronger. The ice sheets began to melt. What happened next would change everything. The transition from the last glacial period to our current interglacial was one of the most dramatic climate changes in recent Earth history. Caught in the middle of that transition were all these megafauna that had evolved to thrive in a frozen world. Most of them wouldn't make it through. We've talked about what these Ice Age giants looked like, but let's get into the details of how they actually lived, because the more we learn about these animals, the more incredible they become. Some of the discoveries are genuinely surprising. Let's start with something that sounds impossible: giant ground sloths digging massive burrows. When the scientists first found these tunnels in South America, particularly in Argentina near Mar del Plata, they weren't what made them. The burrows were huge, some reaching 5 to 6 meters below the surface, up to 1.8 meters wide and 40 meters long. That's a 2-story house worth of tunnel underground. Multiple mammal species were considered as possible diggers, but the evidence kept pointing to ground sloths, specifically species like Glossotherium and Celidotherium. The first clue was their arm bones. Ground sloth forelimbs were designed in a shovel-like structure with unusually long second and third fingers, perfect for digging. And the bones were super strong, designed to withstand the kind of bending forces you'd get from digging through hard soil, similar to the stresses that galloping mammals put on their leg bones. The second clue was their center of gravity. Paleontologists estimated from the skeleton that ground sloths had their center of gravity above their hind feet, which means they could rear up into a bipedal posture. This is crucial for digging because your arms need to be free to excavate, not supporting your body weight. You can't dig effectively if you're on all fours. And the final smoking gun was the claw marks on the walls and ceilings of the burrows, perfectly preserved in the fossilized tunnels. Scientists matched these marks to ground sloth hand skeletons, and they fit exactly. These sloths weren't just big. They were engineering huge underground structures for animals weighing 800 to 1,200 kilograms. This is incredible behavior. Why were they doing it? The leading theories are either temperature regulation or predator avoidance. Underground temperatures are much more stable than on the surface. If you're trying to escape extreme heat or cold, a burrow makes sense. Or maybe they were hiding from predators like saber-toothed cats or giant short-faced bears. When you're big but not fast, going underground where predators can't easily follow you is a smart strategy. Either way, it shows these animals were way more behaviorally complex than we might expect from something called a giant sloth. Here's another fascinating discovery about ground sloths. In Ecuador, at a site called Tank Loma, paleontologists found the remains of at least 22 Aramotherium sloths of various ages, all in the same location. They likely died during a drought, getting trapped in a shrinking watering hole. But the cool part is what this tells us about their behavior. They were congregating at watering holes, which means they were social animals living in groups. And they were probably wallowing in the water to escape heat and insects, similar to how hippos and rhinos behave today. I find it incredible to imagine. The last mammoths existed on Wrangler Island in the Arctic Ocean. It's incredible to think that only about 4,000 years ago, after the pyramids of Giza were already standing, These giants were still walking around on a remote Arctic island. Mammoths and ancient civilizations overlapped in time. Then they vanished, likely due to inbreeding, habitat loss on their small island, and perhaps even climate change or the arrival of humans. It was the end of an evolutionary line that had stretched for millions of years. Even during glacial periods, not the entire planet was frozen. Tropical and subtropical regions still experienced warm seasons. The climate was cooler and drier than it is today, but equatorial regions weren't covered in ice sheets. So animals living in those areas still had to find ways to cope with the heat during the warmest parts of the year. It turns out that ground sloths in South America were using strategies very similar to those used by large African mammals today. Speaking of mammoths, the ones preserved in the Siberian permafrost have given us an incredible amount of information. Some of these frozen mammoths even have their last meals preserved in their stomachs. When scientists examined this material, they found grasses, sedges, herbs, flowers, and mosses. It paints a vivid picture of the mammoth steppe ecosystem and the plants that were available. We've also extracted DNA from these frozen specimens and sequenced entire mammoth genomes. This genetic analysis revealed some fascinating adaptations. Mammoths had variants of hemoglobin, the protein that carries oxygen in the blood, that functioned better in cold temperatures. Normal hemoglobin doesn't release oxygen as efficiently when it's cold, which would be a problem for an animal living in freezing conditions. But mammoth hemoglobin had mutations that compensated for this, allowing their blood to deliver oxygen effectively even when their body tissues were cold. We've also found that mammoths had genes for small ears, sparse sweat glands, and improved fat storage, all encoded in their DNA. Evolution didn't just change their external appearance, it rewired their physiology at the genetic level. Woolly rhinoceroses are another species we know a lot about from frozen specimens. Like mammoths, they had thick, woolly coats and were built for the cold, but their behavior was probably different, based on their tooth wear and the isotopes in their bones. Scientists believe woolly rhinos were more selective feeders than mammoths. While mammoths were bulk grazers, eating whatever vegetation was available, woolly rhinos seemed to be pickier, probably using their horns to dig through snow to find the specific plants they preferred. The giant deer, Megaloceros, had antlers that were absolutely enormous. The largest specimens had antlers spanning over 3.5 meters from tip to tip, wider than a car. These antlers could weigh up to 40 kilos. Carrying that much weight on your head takes serious neck and shoulder muscles. Scientists believe these massive antlers were primarily for display and competition between males, similar to how modern deer use their antlers. During mating season, males would show off their antlers to females and use them in battles with rival males. The bigger your antlers, the more impressive you looked. But those antlers came at a cost. Growing them required huge amounts of calcium and energy, and carrying them around was energetically expensive. Only the healthiest, best-fed males could support truly enormous antlers. Cave bears are interesting because, despite their name and size, they were mostly herbivorous. Isotope analysis of their bones shows they ate primarily plants. They were built like grizzly bears, but acted more like giant pandas. They hibernated in caves during winter, which is where we find most of their fossils. Some caves in Europe have thousands of cave bear bones, representing hundreds or thousands of individuals that hibernated there over millennia. Cave bears went extinct earlier than many other megafauna, around 27,000 to 24,000 years ago, well before the end of the last glacial period. The reasons aren't entirely clear, but it might have been related to competition with humans for cave space, climate changes affecting their food supply, or a combination of factors. Glyptodons are still blowing my mind the more I learn about them. Recent studies of their skeletal structure and muscle attachment points suggest they were capable of some surprising behaviors. They might have been able to rear up, but they also show adaptations for powerful digging, similar to what we see in modern armadillos, but scaled up massively. So these armored giants might have dug burrows like their ground sloth contemporaries. Imagine tunnels big enough for a Volkswagen Beetle to drive through, created by armored animals with spiky tails. The Ice Age was truly wild. The predators of the Ice Age were just as specialized as the herbivores. Saber-toothed cats didn't just have those impressive fangs for show. Biomechanical studies of their skulls show they had relatively weak bite forces compared to modern big cats, but their neck muscles were incredibly powerful. Their hunting strategy was probably to use their strong forelimbs to wrestle prey down, then use their neck muscles to drive those saber teeth deep into the prey's throat or belly. With precision. It wasn't about crushing force. It was about precision. Dire wolves fascinate me, especially when I consider the sheer number of their fossils found in the La Brea tar pits. Thousands of individuals trapped over tens of thousands of years. Imagine their struggle, drawn to the sticky asphalt while trying to scavenge prey that was already hopelessly stuck. It paints such a vivid picture of a desperate, dangerous world. The fossils themselves tell a story, too. Many dire wolf specimens show broken teeth, healed fractures, and signs of arthritis, especially in older wolves. It suggests a social structure, a pack that cared for its injured and elderly. A wolf with broken teeth can't hunt alone, but if the pack shares food, it survives. It seems their social complexity mirrored that of modern wolves. Then there are the giant short-faced bears. Were they primarily predators or scavengers? The evidence is mixed, which only adds to their mystery. Their long legs suggest an ability to cover ground, useful for scavenging. But their powerful jaws and teeth, those were definitely capable of taking down prey. Perhaps they were opportunistic, hunting when they could, scavenging when they had to. Their size alone, potentially the largest mammalian land predator ever, likely allowed them to intimidate smaller predators and steal their kills. I can almost see it. A pack of dire wolves bringing down a bison, only for a giant short-faced bear to appear and chase them away. One of the coolest things about studying these Ice Age ecosystems is the evidence we find in the most unexpected places. Ancient DNA in sediments. Even without bones or visible fossils, animal DNA can be preserved in frozen soil. Scientists have developed ways to extract and identify this environmental DNA, revealing which species lived where and when. It fills in the gaps in the fossil record, showing us just how diverse these ecosystems truly were. We now know that horses were present in areas where we have no horse fossils. simply because we found horse DNA in the soil. We've identified plants that grew in certain regions by finding their pollen and DNA. We can even infer the climate based on the species of plants and insects present. It's like reading an ancient ecological record written in genetic code. And then there are the humans, observing and interacting with this megafauna. They left records of what they saw. The cave art in places like Lascaux and Chauvet Cave shows remarkably accurate depictions of Ice Age animals: mammoths, woolly rhinos, bison, horses, cave lions. These aren't crude stick figures. They're sophisticated artworks showing animals in motion, using the natural contours of the cave walls to create three-dimensional effects. The artists clearly spent a lot of time observing these animals to capture them so accurately. Some paintings even show details like fur patterns, seasonal coat changes, and behavioral poses. There's a painting of a woolly rhino that clearly shows its thick fur and the way it held its head. There are paintings of mammoths that show their characteristic domed heads and long tusks. These artworks are a direct visual record of what Ice Age megafauna looked like, created by people who saw them alive. Humans also left behind butchered animal bones, showing clear cut marks from stone tools, mammoth bones with spear points embedded in them, campsites with hearths surrounded by the remains of horses, bison, and reindeer. The archaeological record proves that humans hunted megafauna, relying on them for food, materials for tools and clothing, and fat for fuel. Mammoth ivory was carved into art objects and tools. Hides were used for clothing and shelter. Bones were used to build dwelling structures in areas with scarce wood. Every part of these animals was utilized. But humans weren't just passive observers or simple hunters. There's evidence that humans might have used fire to manage landscapes, creating and maintaining the open grasslands that megafauna depended on. By burning vegetation regularly, humans could prevent forests from encroaching on grasslands, keeping habitats open for the large herbivores they hunted. This kind of ecosystem engineering might have actually helped support megafauna populations in some regions. The relationship between humans and megafauna was complex, not just predator and prey. The 100,000-year cycle had created this entire world. The cold phase of the cycle produced these unique ecosystems and drove the evolution of specialized megafauna adapted to frozen conditions. For hundreds of thousands of years, the pattern repeated. Ice sheets advanced. Megafauna thrived. Ice sheets retreated. Forests expanded. Ice sheets advanced again. Life adapted to this rhythm. But then, about 19,000 years ago, the cycle began shifting toward warming again, and this time, something was different. This time, humans had spread across most of the world, developed sophisticated hunting technologies, and existed in larger numbers than ever before. This time, when the climate started changing and the ice began to melt, the megafauna wouldn't just adapt and wait for the cycle to swing back to cold like they had for hundreds of thousands of years. This time, most of them were going to disappear forever. And we're still debating exactly why. Around 19,000 years ago, the 100,000-year cycle reached a turning point. The orbital configuration shifted into a pattern that favored warming. Northern Hemisphere summers started getting stronger, receiving more solar radiation. When that happens, winter snow starts melting more completely each summer, Ice sheets stop growing and begin their long retreat. The transition from glacial to interglacial conditions was underway. Deglaciation isn't a smooth process, it's messy. It happens in fits and starts, with sudden collapses and temporary reversals. There are even periods of rapid change that would have been noticeable within a single human lifetime. And this very messiness is what makes understanding the extinction of the megafauna so complicated. The first major pulse of melting kicked off around 19,000 years ago and continued for several thousand years. As the ice sheets melted, sea levels began to rise. During one period, around 14 or 600 years ago, which we call Meltwater Pulse 1A, sea levels rose by roughly 20 meters in less than 500 years. Now, 20 meters might not sound like much, but think about what that actually means. It's enough to flood vast coastal areas, submerge land bridges, and completely transform coastlines. And all that water, of course, had to come from somewhere. It came from collapsing sections of the great ice sheets. The Laurentide ice sheet, that massive dome of ice covering Canada, began breaking apart. The Fennoscandian ice sheet in Europe did the same. As they melted, they left behind a landscape that had been compressed under kilometers of ice for thousands of years. The land was scraped clean, covered in glacial till, and dotted with lakes formed in depressions carved by ice. I imagine it must have been a raw, bare landscape at first, slowly being colonized by plants as the climate warmed. But the warming wasn't steady. There were dramatic interruptions. The most famous is the Younger Dryas event. By around 14,700 years ago, the world had been warming for thousands of years, ice sheets in retreat. Things seemed to be heading toward interglacial conditions. Then suddenly, temperatures crashed. In Greenland, temperature dropped by about 15 degrees Celsius in just a few decades, possibly faster. Some evidence suggests it could have happened in as little as 10 to 20 years. The North Atlantic region was plunged back into near glacial conditions that lasted over 1,000 years. What caused this dramatic reversal? The leading theory involves a catastrophic flood. As the Laurentide ice sheet melted, water pooled up behind it, forming enormous glacial lakes. The largest was Glacial Lake Agassiz, which was bigger than all of the modern Great Lakes combined. This lake was dammed in by the ice sheet itself, and when that ice dam failed, which geological evidence suggests it did multiple times, absolutely stupendous amounts of fresh water flooded into the ocean in a geologically instant time frame. We're talking about enough water to raise global sea levels by several meters, all released in months to years. This massive freshwater dump disrupted ocean circulation in the North Atlantic. There's this ocean circulation pattern called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC. It's basically a conveyor belt where warm surface water flows north, cools down near Greenland, becomes dense and sinks, then flows south at depth. This circulation transports enormous amounts of heat from the tropics to the northern hemisphere, but fresh water is less dense than salt water. When you dump a huge amount of fresh water into the North Atlantic, it floats on top and prevents the normal sinking of cold, dense water. This can slow down or shut down the AMOC, and when the AMOC stops, the northern hemisphere stops receiving that massive heat transport from the tropics. Temperatures crash, and you're back to near glacial conditions. The Younger Dryas had effects far beyond the North Atlantic. Climate patterns shifted across the globe. Some regions got drier, others wetter. Temperatures changed, and this had huge impacts on ecosystems and the animals living in them. For megafauna that were already stressed by changing habitats as the climate warmed and forests expanded, the Younger Dryas cold snap might have provided a temporary reprieve, but it also added instability to an already unstable situation. And it had major impacts on human societies, too. In the Middle East, this is right around the time agriculture first developed. Some scientists think the climate stress of the Younger Dryas might have pushed hunter-gatherer groups to start deliberately cultivating plants as a way to end food security when wild resources became unreliable. If that's true, then this climate event triggered by the 100,000-year cycle transitioning from glacial to interglacial literally changed the course of human history, setting us on the path to farming, settled civilizations, and everything that followed. But eventually, around 11,700 years ago, the Younger Dryas ended, and it ended just as abruptly as it started. Temperatures spiked upward again. In some regions, temperatures rose by 10 degrees Celsius or more in just a decade or two. That's mind-bogglingly fast for natural climate change. The Amos kicked back into gear. Heat flooded northward again. Ice sheets resumed their collapse, and this time there was no going back. The transition to full interglacial conditions was complete. We call this the beginning of the Holocene, our current geological epoch, and it marks the end of the last glacial period. For the megafauna, this was catastrophic. They had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to thrive in cold, open grassland environments. But as the Holocene began, those environments were disappearing. The mammoth steppe, that unique ecosystem of cold grasslands that had supported enormous populations of large herbivores, was transforming. Forests were expanding, grasslands were shrinking. The climate was getting wetter and warmer. For animals adapted to cold and dry conditions, this was a crisis, and the extinctions came fast. In North America, most megafauna disappeared between about 13,000 and 11,000 years ago. Mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, giant short-faced bears, all gone within a few thousand years. That's 70 to 80% of large mammal species just vanished. It was devastating. The quaternary extinction event. Across the globe, megafauna vanished. In Europe, woolly mammoths disappeared from most of their range, clinging to existence only in isolated pockets like Wrangler Island. The woolly rhino, the cave lion, the giant deer, gone or drastically reduced in number. The megafauna that had dominated Europe during the Ice Age simply vanished. South America suffered similar losses. Giant ground sloths, gone. Glyptodonts, gone. Native horses and camels, extinct. Toxodons, macrochenia, giant armadillos, all gone. The extinction wave swept through the Americas like wildfire. Australia had already lost most of its megafauna earlier, between 50 and 40,000 years ago. Giant wombats, enormous kangaroos, massive flightless birds, even a marsupial lion, all disappeared. Interestingly, the timing in Australia seems to coincide more with the arrival of humans than with the last deglaciation. So, what caused all this? What killed them? It's a question that's been debated for decades, and honestly, it's still not completely settled. There are two main schools of thought: the climate change hypothesis and the human hunting hypothesis. The truth, as is often the case, is probably a combination of both, with the relative importance varying by region and species. The climate change hypothesis suggests that the rapid warming and the transformation of ecosystems were simply too much for these animals to handle. Megafauna had evolved for cold, open habitats. When those habitats disappeared in just a few thousand years, they couldn't adapt quickly enough. As forests expanded and grasslands shrank, megafauna populations became fragmented into smaller and smaller pockets of suitable habitat. And small isolated populations are vulnerable to inbreeding, disease, and random environmental fluctuations. It creates a kind of extinction vortex where declining populations face multiple threats that compound each other, making recovery impossible. There's certainly good evidence for climate being a major factor. The extinctions happened during a period of incredibly rapid climate change. Species adapted to cold climates, like woolly mammoths and woolly rhinos, went extinct, while species adapted to forests or warmer climates generally survived. This pattern suggests climate played a significant role. But then, megafauna had survived previous deglaciations. The 100,000-year cycle means there were multiple transitions from glacial to interglacial conditions over the past few million years. If megafauna survived those, why not this one? That's where the human hunting hypothesis enters the picture. Modern humans had spread across most of the world by the end of the last ice age. And humans are incredibly effective hunters, especially with the technological innovations that developed during this period. Atlatls, which are spear throwers that dramatically extend your range and power, sophisticated hunting strategies involving coordinated groups, and later, bows and arrows. Human populations were growing and spreading into new territories. Critically, many megafauna had little or no evolutionary experience with human hunters when humans first arrived in the Americas or Australia. The local megafauna hadn't evolved fear responses to these two-legged predators. They were, in effect, naive prey. Modern examples illustrate this pattern. When humans first reached oceanic islands with no previous human presence, the native birds and mammals often showed no fear and were easily hunted to extinction within decades or centuries. The same might have happened with Ice Age megafauna. They simply didn't recognize humans as threats until it was too late. And here's the thing about hunting megafauna. You don't need to hunt intensively to drive them extinct. These animals have slow reproductive rates. A female mammoth might have a calf only every 5 years, and mammoths don't reach sexual maturity until they're teens. If you kill even a few individuals per year from a population, especially females of reproductive age, you can drive the population into decline. Mathematical models show that even very low-intensity hunting, killing just a few % of the population per year, can drive large-bodied animals extinct over centuries to millennia. And we know humans hunted megafauna. We found butchered mammoth bones at human sites, spear points embedded in mammoth ribs, kill sites where multiple animals were driven off cliffs or into traps and then butchered, cave paintings showing hunting scenes. The evidence is undeniable that humans hunted these animals. The question is, whether hunting alone could cause extinctions, or whether it was just the final straw for populations already struggling with climate change. The timing is certainly suspicious in many regions. In North America, the extinctions coincide almost exactly with the expansion of Clovis culture, a group of humans with particularly effective hunting technology. Clovis points, these distinctive spear points, are found at sites with butchered mammoth remains. Within a few thousand years of Clovis people spreading across North America, the megafauna were gone. That's awfully coincidental timing. A study of the Anzic child, the only known Clovis individual, provides some interesting evidence. This was an 18-month-old child buried about 700 years ago in Montana. Scientists analyzed isotopes from the bones to reconstruct the diet of the child's mother, and they found that mammoth contributed around 40% of the maternal protein diet, similar to the diet of specialized mammoth predators, like scimitar cats. This suggests Clovis people were heavily targeting mammoths, possibly as specialized mammoth hunters. But we need to be careful not to overinterpret. The Anzic child is one individual. We can't say all Clovis people had the same diet or hunting focus. The disappearance of the Ice Age giants is still something that puzzles me. We debate how many people actually existed back then, and whether such small populations could really have hunted mammoths to extinction across an entire continent. Some scientists remain skeptical, and I understand why. The extinction pattern itself is also far from uniform. Some species vanished early, while others persisted longer. Take the mammoths on Wrangel Island, for instance. They survived until about 4,000 years ago, thousands of years after their mainland cousins had disappeared. Cave bears went extinct even before many other species. Dire wolves vanished, yet gray wolves survived. Bison, despite being hunted extensively, also made it. The reasons why some species survived and others didn't are still being unraveled. What is clear, however, is that the combination of climate change and human press proved deadly. Climate change put immense stress on these megafauna populations by fragmenting their habitats and reducing their food supply. Then, human hunting prevented these already struggling populations from ever recovering. Together, these factors created a perfect storm that most megafauna simply couldn't endure. And there may have been indirect effects, too. Humans extensively used fire to manage landscapes, which altered vegetation patterns. The loss of the megafauna themselves also triggered ecosystem-wide effects. Mammoths and other large herbivores acted as ecosystem engineers, maintaining open grasslands. When they disappeared, these grasslands transformed into forests, making the habitat even less suitable for any remaining megafauna. It's a cascade of interconnected effects. What we're left with is this. The 100,000-year cycle had sustained megafauna for hundreds of thousands of years. During the cold phases, they thrived. During the warm phases, they retreated to refugia. And then, during the next cold phase, they expanded again. It was a rhythm that life had adapted to. But this time, when the cycle shifted to warming, there was a new element. Humans, with sophisticated hunting technology and growing populations. The combination of rapid climate change and human press was more than most megafauna could handle, and within just a few thousand years, the Ice Age world of giants was gone forever. Now, let's turn our attention to the humans who lived through these 100,000-year cycles, because their story is just as fascinating as that of the megafauna. And when I say humans, I'm referring to multiple species. We weren't the only ones around during the Ice Age. Neanderthals were already well established when our ancestors arrived, and they deserve far more credit than they typically receive. Neanderthals were, in many ways, the original Ice Age survivors. They evolved in Europe and parts of Asia hundreds of thousands of years ago, enduring glacial cycles long before modern humans ever left Africa. They weren't some brutish, primitive dead end. They were sophisticated, intelligent humans who had adapted incredibly well to glacial conditions. Their adaptations were, in a word, brilliant. Consider their body structure. Neanderthals were short and stocky, with barrel chests and thick, heavy bones. The average male was only about 160 centimeters tall, yet they were built like tanks, seriously muscular, with bones showing massive muscle attachment sites. This wasn't random. It was an adaptation to the cold. Shorter, stockier bodies have less surface area relative to their volume, which means less heat loss. This is Bergmann's rule in action, the same principle that made Ice Age megafauna so large. In cold climates, compact bodies retain heat better, and their faces were distinctive, with large noses and wide nasal passages. This wasn't for aesthetics. Those big nasal cavities acted like built-in air conditioners, warming and humidifying the frigid, dry air before it reached the lungs. Breathing super cold air repeatedly can damage lung tissue, so this was crucial. It's the same adaptation we see in woolly mammoths with their enlarged sinuses. Different species, same solution to the same problem. Convergent evolution at work. But physical adaptations only tell part of the story. Neanderthals had a sophisticated culture and technology. They made complex stone tools using the Levallois technique, where you carefully prepare a core and then strike off flakes of predetermined shapes. This requires planning and mental visualization. You have to see the finished tool in your mind before you even start working the stone. They also made wooden spears, carefully shaped and balanced, with tips hardened by fire. Some of these spears have been found preserved in German peat bogs, and they are beautifully crafted. And Neanderthals hunted big, dangerous game. We found Neanderthal sites with bones of bison, reindeer, wild horses, even woolly rhinoceros and mammoth. These weren't scavenged carcasses. The bones show clear butchery marks made with stone tools while the meat was fresh. Neanderthals were actively hunting animals that could easily kill them if the hunt went wrong. That requires coordination, communication, planning, and courage. They used fire extensively and effectively, not just for warmth and cooking, but for making complex adhesives. Archaeologists have found Neanderthal tools with birch bark tar used to attach stone points to wooden handles. Making birch bark tar requires heating birch bark in the absence of oxygen at specific temperatures. This is a multi-step process that demands technical knowledge and careful control. You can't just stumble into figuring this out. They understood the process and could replicate it reliably. Even more impressive, Neanderthals had symbolic culture. They made ornamental objects, pierced shells and eagle talons that were apparently worn as jewelry. They used pigments, possibly for body painting or decorating objects or cave walls. And they buried their dead, sometimes with what appear to be grave goods or in deliberate postures. There's a famous burial at Shanidar Cave in Iraq that includes evidence that might suggest flowers were placed in the grave, though that's still debated. The fact that Neanderthals intentionally buried their dead, that tells me so much. It speaks to a capacity for abstract thought, for ritual, for grappling with mortality. It's deeply human. And it wasn't just burial. They created art. I've seen the images of those abstract geometric patterns and hand stencils in Spanish caves, dating back to when Neanderthals were the sole occupants of that region. To stand before those images is to feel the immense weight of time. These are among the earliest examples of cave art we know of, evidence of symbolic thought far earlier than we once believed. And it wasn't just one isolated group. Similar markings appear at multiple sites, hinting at a broader Neanderthal culture. So, if Neanderthals were so intelligent, so capable, so well adapted, why did they vanish? This is a question that has occupied me for years. The last Neanderthals disappeared around 40,000 years ago, just as modern humans were spreading across Europe from Africa and the Middle East. The timing is, well, it's hard not to see a connection. Did we outcompete them? Absorb them through interbreeding? Eliminate them directly? Or was it something more subtle? The genetic evidence is clear. Neanderthals and modern humans interbred. If you have European or Asian ancestry, you likely carry 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. It might not seem like much, but it proves that our ancestors and Neanderthals had children together, children who survived and passed on their genes. Some of those Neanderthal genes persist in us today, influencing our immune function, skin and hair traits, and even our susceptibility to certain diseases. In a way, then, Neanderthals aren't entirely gone. They were absorbed into the modern human gene pool. But as a distinct population, with their own unique culture and identity, they didn't survive. Why? Demographics likely played a significant role. Modern human populations appear to have been larger and more dispersed. In a competition for resources, sheer numbers often win. Even if individual Neanderthals were as skilled as individual modern humans, being outnumbered 10 to 1 would eventually lead to being overwhelmed. Modern humans also seem to possess certain technological advantages. While Neanderthals crafted excellent tools, modern humans developed more diverse and specialized toolkits. They created fine bone needles for sewing fitted clothing, offering better insulation than simply wrapping hides. They invented fishing equipment like hooks and harpoons, expanding their food sources. They produced more elaborate art and ornaments, perhaps indicating more intricate social structures or more effective communication. And modern humans maintained wider trade networks. We find materials at modern human sites originating from hundreds of kilometers away, demonstrating long-distance exchange of goods. Neanderthal trade networks were more localized. Trade isn't just about material possessions. It's about the exchange of information and the formation of social bonds. Wider networks facilitate the sharing of ideas and innovations, accelerating cultural evolution and adaptation. Some researchers suggest that modern humans might have had slightly superior language abilities, enabling more complex planning and coordination. Others propose different social structures that were more effective at resource acquisition or child rearing. These are subtle differences not easily discernible from archaeological remains, but over generations they could have compounded into significant advantages. Climate, too, might have played a role. The late Ice Age was marked by extreme climatic instability, with rapid shifts between cold and warm periods. Perhaps Neanderthals, specialized for cold, stable conditions, struggled more with these rapid fluctuations. Modern humans, originating from Africa, with its own climate variability, might have been more adaptable to changing conditions. But this is speculative. We can't say for. What is certain is that by 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals were gone, and modern humans were the only human species left in Europe. And modern humans were spreading everywhere, adapting to every environment Earth had to offer. By the end of the last glacial period, humans had reached every continent except Antarctica. They had done it while surviving the 100,000-year cycle at its most extreme phase. Modern humans developed an impressive array of technologies during the late Ice Age. Projectile weapons were a game changer. Early humans used thrusting spears, which required close proximity to prey, a dangerous proposition when hunting mammoths. Then they invented the atlatl, a spear thrower that acts as a lever arm to dramatically increase throwing range and power. Suddenly, they could attack from tens of meters away, a much safer distance. Later, probably between 20 and 30,000 years ago, in some regions, humans invented the bow and arrow. This was a monumental development. Arrows are faster and more accurate than atlatl darts. You can carry more ammunition. You can hunt smaller, faster animals more effectively. The bow might be one of the most important technological innovations in human history. It fundamentally changed how humans could acquire food and defend themselves. Hunting strategies became more sophisticated, too. There's evidence of drive hunting, where groups would herd animals toward cliffs or into constructed traps. Sites with hundreds of bison or horses driven off cliffs and butchered. This requires serious coordination among large groups of people. Scouts, drivers, people positioned at the cliff to finish off injured animals, butchers, all working together with precise timing. It's complex social behavior that demands communication and planning. Fishing also became important. Humans developed harpoons, fish hooks made from bone, and nets, opening up aquatic resources as a major food source. The Ice Age wasn't just about survival. It was a time of rich inner lives, symbolic thinking, spiritual beliefs, and cultural traditions. Humans were fully modern mentally and behaviorally, even though they lived in conditions we'd find incredibly harsh. It's easy to forget that, looking back through the lens of modern life. One crucial food source, especially in coastal and riverine areas, was fish. Fishing carried relatively low risk compared to hunting mammoth. Coastal sites show intensive exploitation of fish and shellfish, with enormous shell middens representing thousands upon thousands of meals. Clothing technology improved dramatically as well. Those bone needles that appear around 40,000 years ago, they were for sewing fitted clothing with sleeves and clothes. If you've ever tried staying warm by just wrapping animal hides around yourself, you know it's not very effective. Fitted clothing is way better at trapping body heat. This technology probably allowed humans to survive in even colder regions and remain active during winter, instead of just hunkering down. Shelter evolved, too. In regions with scarce wood, people built structures using mammoth bones and tusks as framework covered with hides. These mammoth bone houses have been found in Ukraine and Russia. Some use bones from dozens of individual mammoths, representing thousands of kilograms of material. These were substantial dwellings, not temporary camps. People were investing serious effort into creating comfortable, long-term living spaces. And let's talk about art, because Ice Age humans created stunning artwork. Cave paintings like those at Lascaux and Chauvet in France are justly famous. These aren't crude drawings. They're sophisticated, dynamic images of animals rendered with incredible skill and accuracy. The artists used the natural contours of cave walls to create three-dimensional effects. They mixed pigments to achieve different colors. They understood techniques like shading and perspective. Some paintings show animals in motion, running or fighting, capturing movement in a static image. But it wasn't just cave paintings. People carved figurines from ivory, bone, and stone. The Venus figurines, stylized female forms found across Europe, date to this period. Some have elaborate details like hairstyles or clothing carved into them. People made musical instruments, flutes carved from bird bones or mammoth ivory. They created elaborate burials with grave goods, including thousands of ivory beads sewn onto clothing. One burial of children at Sunir in Russia included so many beads that researchers estimated it would have taken thousands of hours to make them. These people valued symbolic expression enough to invest enormous time and effort into it. Why did humans create art? Probably lots of reasons. Some cave art might have been connected to hunting magic or spiritual rituals. Some figurines might have been religious or fertility symbols. Some art was probably just for aesthetic plea or social bonding. Human populations during the Ice Age weren't huge by modern standards. Estimates suggest maybe just a few million people worldwide, but those people had spread across most habitable regions. They'd reached Australia by at least 65,000 years ago, crossing significant water gaps even during low sea levels. They'd spread throughout Asia and Europe. And critically, they'd made it to the Americas. The peopling of the Americas is fascinating. During peak glaciation when sea levels were low, the Bering Land Bridge connected Asia and North America. But this wasn't just a narrow strip. Beringia was a vast region, probably thousands of kilometers wide, with its own ecosystems. Humans crossed it, probably following game animals, entering a continent with no previous human population and megafauna that had never encountered human hunters. The timing is still debated. The oldest widely accepted sites in the Americas date to about 15 to 16,000 years ago. But there are controversial sites that might be older, suggesting people could have arrived as early as 20 to 30,000 years ago. Either way, once humans were in the Americas, they spread incredibly fast. Within just a few thousand years, there's evidence of human presence from Alaska to the southern tip of South America. That's an incredible migration speed, and remember, the American megafauna went extinct shortly after humans arrived. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, horses, camels, all gone within a few thousand years of human appearance. The timing suggests humans played a major role. The Clovis people, with their distinctive spear points and apparent focus on hunting mammoths, have been particularly implicated. But it's complicated. Climate was changing rapidly at the same time. It's probably both factors working together. By the time the Holocene began 11,700 years ago, humans were the dominant large animal on multiple continents. We'd outlasted Neanderthals and other human species. We'd survived the wild climate swings of deglaciation. We'd adapted to every environment, from tropical rainforest to Arctic tundra. And we developed incredibly diverse cultures and technologies. Despite being one species genetically, humans showed cultural diversity that no other species has ever matched. This set the stage for what came next, the development of agriculture and the rise of civilization. But that's a different chapter in the story. The point is, the Ice Age and its 100,000-year cycle was the crucible that forged modern human behavior. The technological innovations, the social structures, the symbolic thinking, all developed or were refined during the harsh conditions of glacial cycles. We are, in a very real sense, products of the Ice Age. Our success as a species was built on adaptations to a frozen world, and now that world is gone, melted away as the cycle shifted to its warm phase. The question is, I sometimes wonder if we're truly suited for the world we inhabit now. Are we just carrying ancient baggage from an ice age that ended millennia ago? That 100,000-year cycle has undeniably shifted. The ice has melted, the megafauna are mostly gone, and we humans now live in a world utterly unlike what our ancestors knew for hundreds of thousands of years. Welcome to the Holocene, our current interglacial period, where everything transformed for human societies. Around 11,700 years ago, the Younger Dryas cold snap finally ended. Temperatures rose rapidly and stabilized, creating conditions similar to today. The climate became warmer and wetter than it had been during the glacial period. Forests expanded, spreading across what had been cold grasslands and tundra. Sea levels rose as the last ice sheets melted, flooding coastlines and creating the geography we recognize. The transformation was dramatic and relatively fast. For humans who had lived as hunter-gatherers, this shift presented both opportunity and challenge. Warmer temperatures meant longer growing seasons, more diverse vegetation, and a more predictable climate. But the megafauna they hunted were disappearing. The massive herds of mammoth, bison, and horses that had been reliable food sources were gone or going extinct. Humans had to adapt their survival strategies quickly or face serious problems. In some regions, people turned heavily to fishing and gathering shellfish. Coastal sites from this period show enormous shell middens and fish bone deposits. The ocean was stable and productive, providing reliable food. In other regions, people focused more on smaller game like deer, rabbits, and birds, supplemented with gathered nuts, seeds, roots, and berries. These required different hunting techniques than megafauna hunting. You can't drive deer off cliffs effectively. You need different tools and strategies. But in a few special regions, something revolutionary happened. People started deliberately planting and cultivating wild plants. This was the beginning of agriculture, and it changed everything about human society. The first clear evidence of agriculture appears in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East around 11 to 10,000 years ago. people started cultivating wheat and barley, domesticating sheep and goats. In China, rice and millet cultivation began around 9,000 years ago. In Mesoamerica, maize was domesticated around the same time in multiple regions independently within just a few thousand years of each other. Humans invented farming. Why did agriculture develop when it did? It's been debated forever. One theory points to population pres. During the Ice Age, human populations were kept relatively small by harsh conditions and limited food resources. But as the Holocene began and conditions improved, populations might have grown to the point where hunting and gathering couldn't support everyone. Agriculture produces more calories per unit of land than hunting and gathering, so it can support higher population densities. If your population outgrows your hunting territory, you either starve, migrate, or innovate. Some groups chose innovation. Another theory emphasizes climate stability. Agriculture requires planning for the future. You plant seeds and wait months for harvest. This only makes sense if you can reasonably predict that conditions will remain suitable for plant growth. During the wildly fluctuating climate of the late Ice Age, with events like the Younger Dryas, that wasn't a safe bet. But during the Holocene, climate became more stable and predictable. You could plant in spring and be reasonably confident summer would come and your crops would mature. This stability made agriculture viable in a way it hadn't been before. There's also a theory that the Younger Dryas specifically triggered agriculture in the Middle East. The idea is that hunter-gatherers in the Fertile Crescent had developed semi-sedentary lifestyles during the warm period before the Younger Dryas, living in villages and intensively harvesting wild grains. Then the Younger Dryas hit, and those wild grains became less productive. To maintain their lifestyles and avoid starvation, people started actively cultivating the grains, selecting for varieties that produced more food. When the Younger Dryas ended, they were already farming and just continued. Whatever triggered it, agriculture spread rapidly once it started, and it came with a massive package of changes to human society. You can't be nomadic and farm effectively. You need to stay in one place to tend crops and protect them from animals and thieves. So agriculture led to permanent settlements, villages that grew into towns and eventually cities. These settlements required new forms of social organization. Who controls the land? How do you store surplus food? How do you defend your settlement? How do you resolve disputes? Agriculture also changed human diets dramatically, and not always for the better. Hunter-gatherers typically had diverse diets with lots of protein and varied nutrients from many plant and animal sources. Early farmers ate mostly carbohydrates from a few grain crops, supplemented with whatever else they could grow or gather. Skeletons from early agricultural societies show signs of nutritional stress compared to hunter-gatherers. More cavities from all the starchy foods, shorter average stature, diseases associated with dietary deficiencies. Agriculture allowed population growth, but individual health often declined. Disease became a much bigger problem once humans started living in permanent settlements. When you're nomadic and move frequently, your waste gets left behind, and diseases don't have time to build up. But in permanent villages, the transition from the Ice Age to the world we know now happened in the blink of an eye, geologically speaking. Within just a few thousand years, Small bands of mobile hunter-gatherers transformed into complex societies living in cities of tens of thousands. It's an almost unbelievable rate of change. I find myself often pondering the ecological consequences of this Holocene transition. It wasn't just about the extinction of megafauna. Forests expanded dramatically, reshaping countless ecosystems. Species adapted to open grasslands had to move, adapt, or disappear entirely. Cold-adapted species retreated northward or to higher elevations, while those that thrived in warmer climates expanded their ranges. The distribution of life across the planet shifted massively in those few thousand years. And humans, we were increasingly shaping these ecosystems, often without fully understanding the long-term effects. With high population densities came waste accumulation, contaminated water, and close contact with domestic animals, creating perfect conditions for infectious diseases. Many diseases that plague us even today, including measles, smallpox, tuberculosis, and influenza, originated in domestic animals, jumping to humans after we began living in close proximity to livestock. Farming, while revolutionary, also made us more vulnerable to epidemics. But agriculture had one overwhelming advantage. It could support far more people per unit of land. A square kilometer of wheat fields could feed dozens, even hundreds of people, while the same area of wild land might support only a handful of hunter-gatherers. This meant agricultural societies could grow to much larger populations, meaning more workers, more soldiers, more inventors, more of everything. When agricultural societies came into contact with hunter-gatherer societies, the farmers usually won through sheer numbers, even if the individual hunter-gatherers were healthier and better warriors. Over a few thousand years, agriculture spread across most of the world where the climate allowed it. Sometimes it spread through the migration of farming peoples, displacing or absorbing hunter-gatherers. Other times, hunter-gatherers adopted farming from their agricultural neighbors. Either way, most humans transitioned from mobile hunting and gathering to sedentary farming, setting the stage for the rise of complex civilizations. Permanent settlements grew into cities. These cities required food from surrounding agricultural areas, leading to the development of trade networks. Trade, in turn, required record-keeping, which led to the invention of writing in multiple regions independently. Complex societies developed hierarchies with rulers, priests, craftspeople, farmers, and even slaves, forming distinct social classes. Organized religion became more prominent, with monumental architecture like temples and pyramids built to honor gods or rulers. Specialized occupations emerged as some people focused full-time on pottery, metalworking, weaving, or administration instead of food production. The first civilizations emerged in river valleys where agriculture was particularly productive. Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates, Egypt along the Nile, the Indus Valley in South Asia, the Yellow River in China. These civilizations developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, all the hallmarks of complex society. It's important to remember that while these civilizations were rising, there were still hunter-gatherer societies thriving in other parts of the world. Australia's Aboriginal peoples maintained their hunter-gatherer lifestyles for tens of thousands of years after agriculture was invented elsewhere. In the Americas, many groups remained hunter-gatherers, even while others developed agriculture and built cities. In Africa, groups like the Sand People hunted and gathered successfully until very recently, and some still do. Agriculture wasn't inevitable or universally adopted. It was one strategy among many, one that happened to be very successful at supporting large populations and complex societies, but not the only viable way to live. Indigenous peoples around the world used fire as a landscape management tool, burning regularly to maintain open areas that attracted game animals or promoted the growth of useful plants. This burning had huge effects on vegetation patterns. What we often think of as natural, pristine ecosystems are often actually anthropogenic, shaped by thousands of years of human fire management. In Australia, Aboriginal burning transformed large areas from dense forest to open woodland and grassland. In North America, Native American burning maintained vast prairies and savannas that might otherwise have been forested. When Europeans arrived and disrupted these burning practices, ecosystems often shifted dramatically. Forests grew in where they hadn't been for millennia. Fire-adapted species declined, while fire-sensitive species increased. The wilderness Europeans saw wasn't pristine nature. It was often the result of thousands of years of active human management. The extinction of megafauna also had cascading ecological effects that we're still working to understand. Mega-herbivores like mammoths weren't just eating plants. They were ecosystem engineers. They knocked down trees, maintained open areas, distributed nutrients through their dung, and created trails and wallows. When they disappeared, these functions disappeared too. Some scientists believe forests expanded after the Ice Age partly because there were no longer giant herbivores suppressing tree growth. There's even a hypothesis that megafauna extinction contributed to climate change. Large herbivores produce a lot of methane, a potent greenhouse gas, from their digestive systems. When megafauna populations crashed, methane emissions might have decreased significantly, and the transformation from open grasslands to forests changed the reflectivity of the land surface, affecting how much solar energy was absorbed versus reflected. The loss of the megafauna had surprisingly large consequences for human societies. For thousands of years, we had hunted these massive creatures, utterly dependent on them. Their extinction wasn't just a loss of food, it was a loss of vital materials. Mammoth ivory, for example, was essential for crafting tools, creating art, and even constructing shelters. Hides provided clothing. Bones were used for everything imaginable, from needles to the very frameworks of our dwellings. With their disappearance, we humans were forced to find substitutes, which in turn probably drove technological innovations. It's possible that the extinction of the megafauna inadvertently accelerated the transition to agriculture in some regions. When your primary food source vanishes and you can't find adequate replacements by hunting smaller game, you face a stark choice: starve or find a new way to subsist. Agriculture became that new strategy. Those extinctions that marked the end of the Ice Age world might have pushed us toward lifestyles that would ultimately create modern civilization. The Holocene, the geological epoch we're currently in, has been remarkably stable compared to the climate fluctuations of the Pleistocene. Yes, there have been variations. Warm periods, cold periods, droughts, and floods, but nothing like the dramatic swings of the Ice Age, with its rapid warming and cooling events. This stability, I believe, is what allowed civilizations to develop. It's difficult to build cities and plan agriculture when the climate might flip dramatically within a single generation. But the Holocene stability allowed us to make long-term plans and investments, building irrigation systems and monumental architecture that took decades, even centuries, to complete. Different parts of the world experience the Holocene in unique ways. The Sahara Desert, now a vast empty wasteland, was once green and wet during the early Holocene. From about 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, increased monsoon activity brought more rain to North Africa. Rivers flowed through what is now desert. Lakes filled valleys. Vegetation covered areas that are now bare sand. People lived throughout the region, herding cattle and developing agriculture. Rock art from this period depicts hippos, giraffes, elephants, animals that seem impossibly out of place today. But then, around 5,000 years ago, the African monsoons weakened and the Sahara dried out relatively rapidly. Within just a few centuries, the Green Sahara became the desert we know. This desertification forced populations to migrate, many moving to the Nile Valley, where water remained available. Some historians believe this migration and concentration along the Nile contributed to the development of ancient Egyptian civilization. Climate change driving human migration, driving civilization development, it's all interconnected. Similar stories played out elsewhere. The Middle East was relatively wet in the early Holocene, supporting agriculture and early civilizations. But droughts have repeatedly stressed or collapsed civilizations. In Mesoamerica, droughts have been linked to the collapse of Maya civilization. In the American Southwest, extended droughts forced the abandonment of settlements like Mesa Verde. Climate variability during the Holocene has been a constant factor shaping human history, even though the swings were mild compared to the Ice Age. And here we are now, roughly 11,700 years into the current interglacial period. Based on past interglacials, we should eventually slide back into glacial conditions at some point. Different models offer different predictions. Some suggest we have thousands of years before the next glaciation begins. Others think tens of thousands of years. The orbital cycles are complex, and their effects don't always line up predictably. But there's a massive wild card now. Human activity is affecting global climate on a scale that might override the natural cycles entirely. We've increased atmospheric carbon dioxide from the natural interglacial level of about 280 parts per million to over 420 parts per million. That's a 50% increase in just a couple of centuries. The ice core records going back 800,000 years show nothing like this. We're in completely uncharted territory. And this brings us to the big question: what happens next? It's a question that keeps me up at night, if I'm honest. We've spent this whole time talking about how the 100,000-year cycle has controlled Earth's climate for millions of years, creating ice ages and shaping the evolution of life, including us. But now, for the first time in the history of this cycle, one species has the power to override it. And that species is us. Some scientists believe we've already delayed or canceled the next glaciation. The extra carbon dioxide we pumped into the atmosphere warming the planet, making it unlikely that northern hemisphere summers will be cool enough to allow ice sheet formation, even when the orbital cycles shift toward glacial conditions. We might have prevented the next ice age from ever happening. Sounds good, right? Nobody wants kilometers of ice covering Canada and Scandinavia again. But the problem is, we're not just preventing the next ice age. We're warming the planet way beyond normal interglacial conditions, and we're doing it incredibly fast. Let's talk about what we've learned from studying ice age cycles and why it matters right now. First, and most importantly, the climate system has tipping points. It's not linear or gradual. You can push the system for a while and see only small changes, then suddenly cross a threshold and boom, rapid, dramatic shifts happen. The Younger Dryas is a perfect example. Gradual warming, then catastrophic freshwater flooding, then abrupt climate reversal within decades. The system flipped states faster than human lifetimes. We're seeing similar threshold behavior today in multiple parts of the climate. The idea that ice sheets don't melt uniformly has stayed with me. They can remain stable for centuries, only to suddenly accelerate their melting when they reach a certain critical juncture. Ocean circulation patterns, like the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, can weaken gradually, then potentially shut down relatively rapidly, and permafrost, frozen for millennia, can abruptly thaw, releasing greenhouse gases that further amplify warming. These aren't smooth transitions. They are systems where small additional press can trigger enormous responses, and we're pushing multiple systems toward their tipping points at the same time. Arctic sea ice is declining dramatically. The minimum extent in summer has dropped about 40% since satellite measurements began in the 1970s. Some models even suggest ice-free Arctic summers within decades. And, of course, there are feedback loops to consider. Ice reflects sunlight, while ocean water absorbs it. Less ice means more heat absorption, which leads to more warming, which in turn means more ice loss. It's self-reinforcing. The Greenland ice sheet is losing mass at an accelerating rate, around 250 billion tons per year in recent measurements. Greenland holds enough ice to raise global sea levels by about 7 meters if it all melted. While no one expects it to melt entirely soon, even losing a fraction over the coming centuries would massively impact coastlines worldwide. Once major melting begins, feedback effects make it difficult to halt. Exposed darker rock absorbs more heat. Meltwater lubricates the ice base, causing it to flow faster. Warm ocean water gets underneath and melts the ice from below. All positive feedbacks amplifying the initial change. The West Antarctic ice sheet is particularly concerning because much of it sits on bedrock below sea level. Warm ocean water is already getting underneath it, causing melting. Some scientists believe major portions might be committed to collapse over the coming centuries, even if we stopped warming today. If that happens, we're looking at 3 to 5 meters of sea level rise, which would remake coastlines globally and displace hundreds of millions of people. The carbon cycle is being disrupted in ways that mirror the ice age cycles, but reversed and much faster. During glacial periods, carbon dioxide dropped to around 180 to 200 parts per million. During interglacials, it rose to about 280 to 300 parts per million. This roughly 100 parts per million swing took tens of thousands of years, driven by natural ocean and vegetation processes. We've increased carbon dioxide by over 140 parts per million in just over a century, replicating the natural cycle's entire range in a tiny fraction of the time. And we're blowing past natural interglacial levels into territory Earth hasn't seen for millions of years. The last time carbon dioxide was this high was probably the Pliocene epoch, around 3 million years ago. Back then, temperatures were several degrees warmer than today. Sea levels were 15 to 25 meters higher, and the Arctic was forested instead of ice-covered. That's where we're headed if we don't change course. And the rate matters as much as the magnitude. Ecosystems can adapt to gradual changes over thousands of years. Species migrate. Evolution selects for new traits. Ecological communities reassemble. But when change happens in decades or centuries, there's no time for gradual adaptation. Species either move fast enough or they go extinct. We're already seeing range shifts in thousands of species. Plants flowering earlier, animals moving toward poles or up mountains, ocean species shifting to cooler waters. Some species are adapting successfully, others aren't, and we're likely headed for another extinction wave. Maybe not as dramatic as the megafauna extinctions, but significant. Current extinction rates are already elevated above background, and climate change is adding another major stressor on top of habitat loss and pollution. Here's something that keeps scientists up at night. During Ice Age cycles, carbon dioxide changes were a feedback, not a forcing. Orbital variations changed sunlight distribution. This affected temperature. Temperature changes affected ocean chemistry and vegetation, which changed atmospheric carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide then amplified the temperature changes. It was a feedback loop within the system responding to external astronomical forcing. But what we're doing is different. We're directly forcing carbon dioxide changes by burning fossil fuels. This is direct forcing, not feedback. And all those natural feedbacks that amplified carbon dioxide changes during Ice Age cycles, they're still operating. They're amplifying the changes we're causing. We're pushing on a system with built-in amplifiers, and we don't fully understand all of them or where the thresholds are. Permafrost is a huge wild card. There's around 500 billion tons of organic carbon stored in frozen Arctic soils. That's roughly twice as much carbon as currently in the atmosphere. As the Arctic warms, permafrost thaws, and microbes start decomposing that organic matter, releasing carbon dioxide and methane. Classic feedback. Warming causes thawing. Thawing releases greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases cause more warming. How fast this happens is uncertain, but the potential for permafrost to become a major additional carbon source is real and scary. The ocean has absorbed about 90% of the extra heat trapped by greenhouse gases so far, which has slowed atmospheric warming, but at the cost of warming the ocean itself. Warm water holds less dissolved oxygen. We're already seeing expanding dead zones where oxygen has dropped too low to support most life. Marine organisms are stressed by warming, acidification from dissolved carbon dioxide, and oxygen loss simultaneously. Coral reefs are being devastated by repeated bleaching events. These ecosystems that support enormous biodiversity are collapsing. The Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, or AMO, show signs of weakening. The data is noisy, and it doesn't go back very far, but multiple lines of evidence suggest it might be slowing. And if it weakens significantly or even shuts down, it could cause regional cooling in parts of Europe. It's a strange thought, isn't it? Global warming could paradoxically cause regional cooling in some areas. It's just another reminder that climate is complicated and often counterintuitive. What do we do with this knowledge, though? Well, understanding the 100,000-year cycle teaches us that Earth's climate is incredibly sensitive to even relatively small changes. The orbital variations that trigger ice ages, for example, are tiny changes in seasonal sunlight distribution. Yet, they're enough to tip the system from one state to another, especially when combined with feedback loops. And we're applying forcing that's much larger and faster than those orbital variations. The response, therefore, will be substantial. The only real questions are how substantial and on what time scale. We also learned that climate has momentum. Ice sheets take thousands of years to grow, but they can collapse much faster. Once you start major melting, stopping it becomes incredibly difficult. Ocean circulation changes can be hard to reverse as well. Some of the changes we're causing are essentially irreversible on human time scales. Even if we stopped all emissions tomorrow, temperatures would remain elevated for centuries as the ocean and atmosphere slowly find equilibrium. Sea level would continue rising for centuries or millennia as ice sheets keep responding to the warming that's already in the pipeline. It's uncomfortable to think about, I know. We've probably already committed to some significant changes, even with aggressive emission reductions. Some warming, some sea level rise, some ecosystem disruption is already baked in. The question is how much more we add. Every bit of additional warming makes things worse. Every tenth of a degree matters when dealing with systems that have tipping points. The paleoclimate record teaches us that rapid climate change is really hard on societies. Climate changes at the end of the Ice Age contributed to megafauna extinctions and forced major changes in human subsistence. Droughts during the Holocene have toppled civilizations, and those were natural variations, changes that societies had no control over. We're causing changes faster and potentially larger than those natural variations. With over 8 billion people to feed and house, many in areas vulnerable to climate change, the implications are staggering. Coastal cities face flooding from sea level rise. Agricultural regions face shifting rainfall and more extreme weather. Water resources are stressed by changing precipitation and glacial melt. Tropical regions could see temperatures exceeding human survivability thresholds for outdoor work during heat waves. Island nations could literally disappear. The humanitarian implications are enormous and unequally distributed. Those who contributed least to causing climate change are often the most vulnerable to its effects. But understanding the problem is the first step toward addressing it. We know more about climate now than ever before. We can see changes happening in real time with satellites and monitoring. We can model future scenarios with increasing accuracy. And we have technologies available that could dramatically reduce emissions if deployed at scale. Solar and wind are now cost competitive with fossil fuels in many places. Electric vehicles are becoming mainstream. Energy storage is improving. Carbon capture is being developed, though it's not yet proven at the necessary scale. The challenge isn't really technological anymore. It's political, economic, and social. Getting 8 billion people to coordinate on emission reductions, equitably distributing costs and benefits, navigating competing interests, that's the hard part. Climate change is the ultimate tragedy of the commons. Individual actors benefit from burning fossil fuels, but everyone suffers the consequences. Solving it requires collective action at a scale humanity has never achieved. Some people feel despair. The problem seems too big, the change is too slow, the obstacles too numerous. I get that, but humans have navigated existential challenges before. We survived the Ice Age through adaptation and innovation. We transitioned from hunting megafauna to agriculture, fundamentally transforming our relationship with the planet. We've overcome diseases, expanded lifespans, created technologies that would seem like magic to our ancestors. We're not helpless. We're just facing a problem requiring unprecedented coordination. The 100,000-year cycle will eventually resume, assuming we don't permanently alter it. The orbital mechanics haven't changed. Naturally, Earth would eventually slide back into glacial conditions tens of thousands of years from now. But we're writing a new chapter, one where human activity is a major climate driver, not just a responder. We're affecting the planet on a scale comparable to the astronomical forces that controlled climate for millions of years. No species has ever had this influence. It's both inspiring and terrifying. I often wonder what future geologists studying sediments millions of years from now will make of this moment. They'll see a clear marker, isotope ratios reflecting massive carbon combustion, extinction signatures, novel materials like plastics and concrete in the sediment. They'll recognize that something unprecedented happened during this brief moment. Whether they'll also see evidence that we successfully navigated the crisis, well, that's still open. The answer depends on what we do in the coming decades. The cycle reminds us that climate is dynamic, sensitive to forcing, full of feedbacks and tipping points. It's not a stable, unchanging background. It's an active system responding to inputs. For millions of years, those inputs were natural. Now, we're adding a new input, and the system is responding. We're living through a unique moment, a turning point in Earth's 4.5 billion year history. Never before has a single species understood the global climate system while simultaneously altering it. We hold a knowledge and a power that no organism has ever possessed. What we choose to do with that understanding will determine Earth's trajectory for thousands, perhaps even millions of years. Of course, the Ice Age cycles also show us just how resilient life truly is. Earth has endured dramatic climate changes throughout its history, and life has always found a way to survive, adapt, and even thrive. Life survived the asteroid impact that wiped out the dinosaurs. It survived countless ice ages. It will undoubtedly survive this era as well. The real question is whether human civilization as we know it will thrive, or whether we will face disruptions that could have been avoided with foresight and decisive action. I began by discussing the mystery of the 100,000-year cycle and how scientists painstakingly unraveled it. That very same scientific community is now sounding the alarm about anthropogenic climate change, employing the same rigorous methods that revealed the secrets of the Ice Age cycles. If we place our trust in the science that illuminated the past, then we should also heed its warnings about the future. It's abundantly clear that we are pushing the climate system hard, and we will inevitably witness significant responses. The window of opportunity to avert the most catastrophic outcomes is rapidly closing. The Ice Age taught our ancestors the invaluable lessons of adaptability and innovation. That spirit is embedded in our very DNA. We can harness those qualities to navigate the challenges we have created, but it demands collective and swift action. The climate system operates with both momentum and time lags. Actions taken today will not fully manifest their effects for decades to come. However, inaction today commits us to changes that will unfold over centuries. Each year of delay only amplifies the eventual response, making it even more difficult and disruptive to manage. So, where does that leave us? We are 11,700 years into an interglacial period that should eventually conclude. We are armed with a profound understanding of how the climate functions, yet we are actively altering it at a pace that far exceeds natural processes. The 100,000-year cycle that has shaped human evolution is now being overridden by human activity. We have become a geological force in our own right. The only remaining question is whether we will wield that power wisely or recklessly. The answer to that question will determine the kind of planet that future generations inherit, and whether they will remember us as ancestors who rose to the challenge or as a cautionary tale of a species that understood the problem but ultimately failed to act. The clock is ticking. The cycle that has sustained life for millions of years continues to operate in the background. But for the first time, it might not matter because, for the first time, one of the species it created has the power to override it. What we do with that power in the coming decades will determine not only our future, but the future of countless other species that share this planet with us. The Ice Age is over. The question now is, what comes next? And unlike our ancestors, who simply had to endure the cycle, we have the power to shape it. This is both an incredible responsibility and an incredible opportunity. Now, we must see what we will do with it. It might sound crazy, but it's true. We're living in an ice age right now. I know it's hard to believe, especially on a warm day, but this ice age started about 2.6 million years ago, and technically, it hasn't ended. What's even more wild is how every 100,000 years, like clockwork, our planet transforms as massive ice sheets spread across the continents and then melt away again. This cycle has shaped the evolution of life on Earth for millions of years, and the story of figuring out why it happens is pretty incredible. But before we get into the science, consider what this cycle actually creates. When Earth tips into a full glacial period, the planet becomes home to some of the most bizarre and magnificent creatures that have ever existed. I'm talking woolly mammoths trudging through frozen grasslands, giant ground sloths digging tunnels the size of your house, and saber-toothed cats hunting prey that weighed several tons. Then, about 10,000 years ago, most of these incredible animals just vanished. The cycle shifted, ice melted, and suddenly the megafauna that had dominated the planet for hundreds of thousands of years couldn't make it. We're still trying to figure out exactly why. Climate change, humans, both? The debate is still raging. So, I want to break down this 100,000-year cycle, how it works, why it happens, what kind of world it creates during the cold phases, and what happens when it shifts back to warm. We'll meet the creatures that thrived in Ice Age conditions, learn how humans survived and adapted, and understand why it all came crashing down so recently. And at the end, we'll talk about where we are in the cycle right now and what that means for our future. Let's start with the basics. An ice age isn't just a cold period. It's an extended chunk of time, millions of years, where Earth's temperature drops enough that massive ice sheets and glaciers take over large portions of the planet's surface. And we're currently in one, the Pleistocene Ice Age, which kicked off about 2.6 million years ago and technically hasn't ended yet. Now, within any ice age, you get fluctuations. There are glacial periods where it's really frozen and interglacial periods where it warms up. We're in an interglacial period right now and have been for about 11,700 years. So when people say the Ice Age, they usually mean the last glacial period, which lasted from about 115,000 years ago to 11,700 years ago. That's when the ice sheets were at their biggest and the megafauna were running the show. During that last glacial period, the temperature was only about 6 degrees Celsius colder than today on average. 6 degrees doesn't sound like much, right? But we're not talking about 6 degrees in one spot. We're talking about 6 degrees worth of thermal energy being sucked out of the entire planet. All the oceans, all the land masses, the whole atmosphere. That's enough to completely transform the world. Huge ice sheets covered most of Canada and northern Europe. The Laurentide ice sheet in North America and the Fennoscandian ice sheet in Europe were kilometers thick in some places because so much water was locked up in ice. Sea levels dropped by over 100 meters. You could walk from England to France. You could stroll from Asia to Alaska across what's now the Bering Strait. The coastlines were completely different, and the landscape mostly tundra and cold grassland, dry and windswept, nothing like the forests we see today. So what caused this? Why does Earth go through these dramatic swings every 100,000 years? The answer starts with this Serbian scientist named Milutin Milankovic. This guy, back in the early 1900s, figured out something nobody else had really considered. What if ice ages weren't caused by anything happening on Earth, but by changes in Earth's position relative to the Sun? See, Earth's orbit isn't perfectly circular. It's slightly elliptical, and the shape of that ellipse changes over time because of gravitational pulls from other planets, mainly Jupiter and Saturn. Sometimes our orbit is more circular, sometimes it's more stretched out. And this cycle of changing from circular to elliptical and back takes about 100,000 years. That's the first Milankovitch cycle, called eccentricity. When Earth's orbit is highly elliptical, the distance between Earth and the Sun varies more dramatically throughout the year. This affects how much solar radiation hits different parts of the planet at different times. And here's the crucial part. It's not about how much total sunlight Earth gets. It's about where and when that sunlight hits. Northern Hemisphere summers are the key because that's where most of the land is. If northern hemisphere summers are cool enough that winter snow doesn't fully melt, the snow sticks around. Year after year, it piles up. Eventually, you've got ice sheets forming, and once ice sheets start growing, they reflect more sunlight back into space, which cools things down even more, which allows more ice to form. It's a runaway feedback loop. But eccentricity isn't the only cycle. There's also obliquity, which is the tilt of Earth's axis. The more tilted Earth is, the more extreme the seasons. This tilt varies on a roughly 41,000-year cycle. When Earth is less tilted, the difference between summer and winter is milder, which means summer might not be warm enough to melt all the winter ice. Ice accumulates, ice age begins. The third cycle is precession or wobble. Earth wobbles on its axis I find myself thinking often about the Earth's wobble, like a spinning top that's starting to slow down. This seemingly small change actually dictates which hemisphere tilts toward the sun at different points in our orbit. It's a 26,000-year cycle, influencing the contrast between our seasons. Currently, the northern hemisphere experiences winter when Earth is closest to the sun, resulting in milder winters. But this won't always be the case. The precession cycle will eventually flip, leading to much colder winters in the northern hemisphere. When eccentricity, obliquity, and precession combine, they orchestrate Earth's long-term climate patterns. What I find particularly strange is that the 100,000-year eccentricity cycle, the weakest in terms of solar radiation changes, somehow dominates the entire system. Scientists call this the 100,000-year problem, and they're still working to fully explain it. The leading theory suggests feedback mechanisms amplify the eccentricity cycle. Perhaps ice sheets take a long time to form, but collapse relatively quickly. The system may spend most of its time slowly building ice during cool phases, then rapidly melting when conditions shift to warming. This asymmetry could explain why the 100,000-year pattern is so prominent. What we know for certain is that for the past million years, Earth has been experiencing these 100,000-year climate cycles. A slow buildup of ice over tens of thousands of years, followed by relatively rapid melting, and then another slow buildup. During the cold phases, the world became home to some truly incredible animals, the megafauna, and the word mega is no exaggeration. Some of these creatures weighed 4,500 kilograms or more. There are theories about why everything got so big during ice ages. One idea is Bergmann's rule, which states that in cold climates, mammals tend to be larger. A bigger body has a lower surface area to volume ratio, meaning less heat loss. So, bigger bodies stay warm more efficiently in the cold. That's why polar bears are bigger than other bear species and why Ice Age mammals tended toward the gigantics. But size alone doesn't tell the whole story. These animals had incredible adaptations for surviving in a frozen world. The most famous, the poster child of the Ice Age, is the woolly mammoth. Woolly mammoths weren't as huge as you might think. They were about the same size as modern elephants, maybe a bit shorter, but their build was completely different. They had thick, shaggy fur with two layers, a dense underwool, and longer outer guard hairs. This coat could be up to a meter long in places, providing insulation so effective that mammoths could handle temperatures of 40 degrees or colder. They also had small ears to minimize heat loss. Unlike modern elephants with their big floppy ears used for cooling off. A layer of fat up to 9 cm thick provided extra insulation and energy storage. Their skulls were specially shaped too, with large sinus cavities that helped warm and humidify the cold, dry air before it reached their lungs. Breathing in super cold air can damage your lungs, so this was a crucial adaptation. And their teeth were perfect for grinding the tough grasses and sedges that grew on the Mammoth steppe, a unique cold grassland ecosystem that covered huge areas during glacial periods. As their teeth wore down, new ones would move forward from the back of the jaw. A mammoth would go through 6 sets of teeth in its lifetime. We know so much about mammoths because some have been found frozen in permafrost, almost perfectly preserved with fur, skin, and even stomach contents intact. Scientists have studied what they ate, extracted their DNA, and found that they had special hemoglobin variants that worked better in the cold, allowing their blood to deliver oxygen more efficiently in freezing temperatures. These animals were fine-tuned for Ice Age conditions. But mammoths weren't alone. The Ice Age world was packed with megafauna. Woolly rhinoceros roamed the same landscapes, covered in thick fur with massive horns that could reach over a meter long. They used these horns to plow through snow to reach vegetation underneath. Giant ground sloths lived in the Americas, and these weren't the cute little tree sloths we know today. Some species weighed several tons and could stand up to 4 meters tall on their hind legs. They were too big to climb trees, so they lived on the ground, feeding on vegetation and incredibly digging burrows. We found their burrows, tunnels up to 40 meters long, with claw marks on the walls that match their fossilized claws perfectly. There were glyptodonts, basically car-sized armadillos with shells made of fused bone plates. They couldn't roll up like modern armadillos, but they didn't need to. Their shells were tough enough to stop most predators, and some species had club-like tails covered in bony spikes that they could swing as weapons. Recent studies suggest they might have been able to rear up on their hind legs, which means you could have had these armored tanks standing upright and swinging spiked clubs. That's both awesome and terrifying. And then there were the predators. Saber-toothed cats prowled the Americas with canine teeth up to 18 centimeter long, curved like daggers. They used these to deliver killing bites to the throat or belly of prey, causing massive bleeding. Cave lions in Europe and Asia were larger than modern lions. Giant, short-faced bears in North America might have been the largest mammalian land predators ever, standing over 3 meters tall on their hind legs. Dire wolves hunted in packs and had more powerful jaws. I've always been captivated by the sheer scale of time and how different our world once was. Imagine a cycle repeating for hundreds of thousands of years. Ice sheets growing, giant creatures thriving, ice sheets melting, forests expanding, and then it all happening again. But something broke that cycle roughly 11,700 years ago. The ice melted as before, but this time the megafauna didn't survive. I often wonder about the why. Was the warming too rapid? Or did we, humans, finally possess the technology and numbers to hunt these incredible animals to extinction? Perhaps it was a tragic combination of both. Let's picture the last glacial maximum, about 20,000 years ago, the 100,000-year cycle at its coldest. Ice sheets at their peak. A world utterly unlike our own. Imagine Canada completely covered in ice, stretching into the northern United States. Ice up to 3 kilometers thick in places. That's like stacking the Burj Khalifa, the world's tallest building, more than 3 times over, but made of solid ice, covering an entire continent. The weight was so immense that it pressed down on the Earth's crust, deforming the very rock beneath. Europe had its own massive ice sheet, the Fennoscandian, blanketing Scandinavia, the Baltic, parts of Britain, and northern Russia. In total, maybe 15 million cubic kilometers of ice sitting on land. If you spread all that ice evenly across the Earth's land surface, it would be about 100 meters deep everywhere. With so much water locked up as ice, sea levels dropped dramatically by 120 meters. That's as tall as a 40-story building. Coastlines extended far beyond where they are today. The English Channel, gone. Britain was connected to mainland Europe. The Persian Gulf, a river valley. Indonesia was a single landmass connected to mainland Asia. Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania formed one giant continent. And between Alaska and Siberia, a vast grassy plain called Beringia emerged where the Bering Strait now lies. The world map was unrecognizable, but it wasn't just the coastlines that changed. The climate was completely different. It was colder, yes, but also much drier. With so much water locked in ice, and with colder ocean temperatures reducing evaporation, there was simply less moisture in the atmosphere. Deserts expanded, rainforests shrank. The Amazon basin was likely a mix of grassland and scattered trees. The Sahara was even larger than it is today. Much of the world was covered in tundra or steppe, cold, dry grasslands with almost no trees. The ice sheets acted like giant refrigerators, generating cold, dense air that flowed off in powerful winds. These winds picked up dust and silt and carried it vast distances. In some parts of China, dust deposits accumulated to over 100 meters thick during the glacial periods. The dust storms must have been unbelievable, blotting out the sun for days. This was the world at peak glaciation, harsh, cold, dry, and windswept. Yet, life didn't just survive, it thrived. The megafauna weren't just scraping by. They dominated these ecosystems, existing in numbers that may have matched or exceeded the density of large animals in Africa today. The mammoth steppe was the dominant ecosystem across huge swathes of the northern hemisphere. A unique mix of grasses, sedges, herbs, and low shrubs that could handle the cold, dry conditions, supporting enormous populations of large herbivores, mammoths, bison, horses, reindeer, all grazing together in vast herds. Mammoths were iconic, but not alone. Woolly rhinoceroses, equally impressive, were similar in size to modern rhinos, but built for the cold, with thick woolly coats and massive front horns, sometimes over a meter long, used to clear snow and reach the vegetation beneath. Preserved woolly rhinos like mammoths have been found in permafrost, with their fur and soft tissue intact, showing clear adaptations for extreme cold, including small ears and thick layers of fat. Giant ground sloths dominated the Americas. Modern sloths are cute and slow, but Ice Age ground sloths were nothing like that. Megatherium americanum, the largest species, weighed an estimated 3,800 kilograms, heavier than most elephants. They could stand on their hind legs and reach heights of 4 meters or more. These elephant-sized sloths lived on the ground, feeding on vegetation, and we've even found their burrows, tunnels dug into hillsides, some 40 meters long and nearly 2 meters wide. Imagine encountering a multi-ton sloth emerging from an underground tunnel. It sounds made up, doesn't it? But these creatures were real. I've spent years reading accounts of the megafauna that roamed the earth during the Ice Age, and the sheer scale and strangeness of these animals never ceases to amaze me. The ceilings and walls of some burrows still bear the claw marks, perfectly matching those of ground sloths. Scientists believe they dug these tunnels either to escape the extreme temperatures or to hide from predators. Then there were the glyptodons, bizarre relatives of modern armadillos, but scaled up to truly ridiculous proportions. They weighed up to 2 tons, walking on elephant-sized legs. Their bodies were protected by shells made of hundreds of bony plates fused together, much like a turtle, but far larger and heavier. These shells could be over 1.5 meters long, tough enough to stop almost any predator. Some species even had tails covered in bony rings with spikes on the end, basically a medieval mace attached to their body. Biomechanical studies suggest they could rear up on their hind legs, swinging those spiked tails as weapons. The diversity of megafauna during the Ice Age is staggering. In North America alone, you had mammoths, mastodons, a different family of proboscideans with different tooth structures, American horses, American camels, giant beavers the size of bears, stag moose with enormous antlers, and multiple species of giant ground sloths. South America boasted even more ground sloth species, glyptodons, giant armadillos, toxodons, which were kind of like hippo-sized rodent relatives, and macrauchenia, which looked like a weird cross between a camel and a small elephant with a trunk. Eurasia had mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave bears, steppe bison, giant deer called megaloceros with antlers spanning over 3.5 meters and more. And of course there were the predators. Wherever you find large herbivores, you'll find large carnivores hunting them. Saber-toothed cats are probably the most famous Ice Age predator. Smilodon in the Americas had those incredible canine teeth up to 18 centimeters long and flattened like blades. These weren't for crushing bone or gripping, they were precision killing tools. Saber-tooths would use their powerful forelimbs to wrestle prey to the ground, then deliver a killing bite to the throat or belly, severing major blood vessels and causing rapid death from blood loss. The La Brea tar pits in California have preserved thousands of Ice Age animal bones, and saber-tooths are among the most common carnivores found there. This tells us they were successful predators, probably living in social groups like modern lions. And their prey wasn't small. They were taking down bison, young mammoths, horses, and giant ground sloths, big, dangerous animals. Cave lions in Europe and Asia were larger than modern African lions and probably hunted similar prey. Cave bears, despite the scary name, were mostly herbivorous, but they were huge, up to half a ton, and their size alone made them formidable. Then there were giant short-faced bears in North America, which might have been the largest mammalian land predators ever to exist. These bears stood over 3 meters tall on their hind legs and may have weighed up to 800 kilograms. There's debate about whether they were active predators or scavengers, but either way, you definitely didn't want to run into one. Dire wolves were another major predator, especially in the Americas. Real dire wolves, not the fantasy version. They were larger and more heavily built than modern gray wolves, with more powerful jaws designed for crushing bone. They hunted in packs and could take down prey much larger than themselves through coordinated attacks. The La Brea tar pits have yielded thousands of dire wolf fossils, more than any other carnivore, which suggests they were incredibly common. Even birds got in on the megafauna action. Teratorns were some of the largest flying birds ever, with wingspans over 3.5 meters. They probably soared on thermals like modern condors searching for carrion, and there were even larger flightless birds in some regions. The Ice Age world had no shortage of impressive and terrifying predators. But here's what's really fascinating. All of these animals, from the smallest ground squirrels to the largest mammoths, were part of functioning ecosystems. They weren't just wandering around randomly, they had complex relationships with each other and with their environment. Herbivores competed for food and space. Predators hunted herbivores. Scavengers cleaned up the remains. Plants evolved to withstand grazing prey. It was all interconnected. The megafauna themselves were ecosystem engineers. Mammoths, for example, didn't just eat grass. They knocked down trees, creating and maintaining open grasslands. They distributed nutrients across the landscape through their dung. They created trails and wallows. Their actions shaped the entire ecosystem. When you have animals that weigh several tons moving through an environment, they have a huge impact. Scientists have reconstructed these ancient ecosystems using multiple lines of evidence. Fossil assemblages tell us which animals live together in the same places. Isotope analysis of bones and teeth tells us what they ate and what the climate was like. Ancient DNA can be extracted from permafrost sediments, even from sediments with no visible fossils. And this tells us which species were present. Cave paintings created by humans show what animals looked like and how they behaved. By combining all this evidence, we can paint a pretty detailed picture of Ice Age life. One thing that's become clear is that these ecosystems weren't static. They changed and shifted as the climate fluctuated. Even within a glacial period, there were shorter-term climate variations. Events called Dansgaard-Oeschger oscillations caused rapid warming spikes lasting decades to centuries, then rapid cooling again. Standing at the last glacial maximum, looking out over a landscape of ice sheets and cold grasslands with mammoths and rhinos and giant sloths moving through it, you'd be witnessing something that will probably never exist again. These ecosystems are gone now. The megafauna are extinct. I find myself thinking about how that mammoth steppe has vanished, replaced by forests and tundra. It's a lost world, a world created by the 100,000-year cycle. The cold phase of the cycle created the conditions, and life adapted to fill every available niche. For hundreds of thousands of years, this pattern repeated. Cold phase, megafauna thrive. Warm phase, forests expand. Cold phase, again, megafauna come back. It was a rhythm that life on Earth had adapted to. And then, about 19,000 years ago, something started to shift. The orbital cycles were moving into a configuration that favored warming. Northern hemisphere summers were getting stronger. The ice sheets began to melt. The transition from the last glacial period to our current interglacial was one of the most dramatic climate changes in recent Earth history. Caught in the middle of that transition were all these megafauna that had evolved to thrive in a frozen world. Most of them wouldn't make it through. So, we've talked about what these Ice Age giants looked like. But let's get into the details of how they actually lived, because the more we learn about these animals, the more incredible they become. Some of the discoveries are genuinely surprising. Let's start with something that sounds impossible. Giant ground sloths digging massive burrows. When scientists first found these tunnels in South America, particularly in Argentina near Mar del Plata, they weren't what made them. The burrows were huge, some reaching 5 to 6 meters below the surface, up to 1.8 meters wide and 40 meters long. That's a 2-story house worth of tunnel underground. Multiple mammal species were considered as possible diggers, but the evidence kept pointing to ground sloths, specifically species like Glosstherium and Silithrium. The first clue was their arm bones. Ground sloth forelimbs were designed in a shovel-like structure with unusually long second and third fingers, perfect for digging. And the bones were super strong, designed to withstand the kind of bending forces you'd get from digging through hard soil, similar to the stresses that galloping mammals put on their leg bones. The second clue was their center of gravity. Paleontologists estimated from the skeleton that ground sloths had their center of gravity above their hind feet, which means they could rear up into a bipedal posture. This is crucial for digging because your arms need to be free to excavate, not supporting your body weight. You can't dig effectively if you're on all fours. And the final smoking gun. Claw marks on the walls and ceilings of the burrows, perfectly preserved in the fossilized tunnels. Scientists matched these marks to ground sloth hand skeletons, and they fit exactly. These sloths weren't just big. They were engineering huge underground structures for animals weighing 800 to 200 kilos.